I tell people all the time that basically when I have a meeting with people, inevitably the whole concept of pendulum comes to light. And I tell them about how we're about to be living through 1943 all over again. But first, a little bit of background, which I was sharing on Facebook before, was you basically stamped your claim, not to fame, but really made an impression on the world with Promote a Book, pretty much, typically, right?
Yep.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say the impetus for the book came from Roy H. Williams, who owns the fourth largest ad agency in North America for buying radio, and for my agency, Promote a Book, who's the largest and most successful book marketing agency, and we wanted to give our clients a competitive advantage. Well, how do you do that? How do we differentiate ourselves from someone else? Yes, there's talent. Yes, there's insider information and that kind of thing. But more than that, what would give our clients a competitive advantage is by being able to predict the future. Because if we can predict the future, then we know what's going to work today and what's going to work tomorrow so that we can stay ahead of the curve and ahead of our competition. And so that was the impetus for the research that we did for Pendulum.
Right on. So that basically started setting everything up for what is now known as Pendulum. But there was also another book that was in play that you guys go over in the book that helped plant the seeds for Pendulum.
Well, so what happened was it was December of 2002, and Roy was with Dr. Nick Grant from the University of Texas in Austin. Mm-hmm. And Roy said, you know, this sure seems a lot like 1953, again, only in reverse. And Dr. Nick Grant said, yeah, you know, that's kind of interesting. There was a book published back in 1991-92 titled Generations by Strauss and Howe that Bill Clinton used in his election cycle with his marketing team to get himself elected. You might want to go and read that. And so Roy did, and I did as well. And we were in directional agreement with Strauss and Howe. The problem is that they made a lot of exceptions for their system in the book. Like they made the Civil War an exception, and they made several other events an exception. They also only went back 400 years, so their data points were limited in terms of what they had done for research. And so we're like, well, it doesn't seem right. That doesn't seem accurate. Roy is a strong evangelical Christian, and we knew in the Old Testament alone that there were more than 26 mentions of 40-year generational patterns. Mm-hmm. And in Hebrew and Judaism, 40 years is a sacred time frame, and there's a reason for that. So Roy said, it can't be 4 20-year generational patterns. It has to be 2 40-year cycles. And so we said we're in directional agreement, but not full agreement. Roy did the Pendulum presentation from 2003 until 2007, of which he retired. Roy's a real futurist. And I kept doing the presentation from then on out. And in 2010, I did a presentation for the ECPA, the Evangelical Christians Publishing Association, where I did Pendulum. And I was approached by a good friend of mine by the name of Jonathan Merck. Jonathan Merck was the publisher at Thomas Nelson, and said, hey, you know, you should turn that into a book. And so we said, sure. And so we started talking about doing that, and Roy was talking to Carrie Mullis, who's the gentleman who won the Nobel Prize for finding the polymer chain reaction back in the early 90s. Mm-hmm. And Carrie said, you know, the problem with Pendulum is that you do what all bad scientists do, which is that you came up with a hypothesis and then you went out to find data that prove that. But a good scientist will always go out and try to disprove their own hypothesis, and if they can, they'll either find holes and be able to strengthen their hypothesis or tear it apart, and if they can't, then they know that their hypothesis was correct. But you always have to go out to disprove it. And so what Roy and I did is we moved our hypothesis from being North America-centric to Western civilization. We went from 300 or 400 years of research out to 3,000 years. We look at history both qualitative and quantitatively, looking for this pattern. And what we found boggled our minds. It actually scared us how very predictable human nature and human beings are. We are not the unique snowflakes that we like to pretend to be. We do the same thing predictably over and over and over and over again.
That's pretty amazing because, I mean, and at what point did you start having that aha moment? Because you did draw it back 3,000 years. And I tell people, I said, it's not just immediate history. They go back 3,000 years. And there's a point, you brought up evangelical Christianity, that the ultimate we happened the same year of Christ's crucifixion.
Yeah, isn't it interesting that everything kind of lines up with what we call the witch hunt cycle in that context, the height of the we, the zenith of the we. It was really, most history is written by the winners, by the rulers, the military might, or by the religious. And so we assume that there would be a certain level of consistency within a range. Mm-hmm. And I want to say that when we finally got up into the Renaissance and we recognized how precise these patterns were, how exacting they were, how there was no exception, and we had more data at that point, we're like, this is not just a theoretical hypothesis. This is something that's real and that has happened over and over and over again. I've done a lot of other scientific research since with things like holographic theory and simulation theory and other things, but it's really quite interesting how exacting, at least culturally, as groups of people, we do the same thing over and over again. There's also an interesting video that kind of illustrates this. We hear about mob mentality, which is a real thing, but if you look at Derren Brown, Derren Brown, he has a 1-hour show that is called Remote Control. Mm-hmm. And it's about what happens when groups of people do things behind a mask. And it's a really amazing look at how really groups of people move and do things. I would highly recommend that you and everybody else watching this go and watch the video. But it was about the time we hit the Renaissance when we realized how exacting things were, when we started moving outside of the military leaders and the religious leaders to see these same patterns.
Now, one thing we should have gone over is, for people who are really new to it, what is Pendulum? What are the basic tenets of it?
It's a great question. So the idea is, Blackie Sherrod, the famous sports writer from the Chicago Tribune, stated, "The reason history must repeat itself is because we pay so little attention to it the first time." In the Book of Solomon, King David said, "The thing that has been is that which shall be, and that which shall be is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun. Is there anything whereof it may be said, see, this is new? It has already been of old time which was before us." The idea is that human beings are cyclical, that we are predictable in nature, especially in large groups. And pendulum theory, when we went out to do the research, was designed around the idea to identify what that pattern might be, what that system is. And what we discovered was a psychological pattern that human beings always take a good thing too far. And literally, that's what these cycles talk about. So we call it pendulum because what you have is you start off at point zero. Everything is fine with most people. It's not pro or against. It's not me. It's not we. It's just kind of in between. And the youth of society take an idea and start moving it up. And then they take it by the zenith, they take that thing too far, and the new youth of society, this is a 20-year upswing, the new youth of society in 20 years says this has gone too far, and they pull it back down the other way. Until that downward swing of youth goes up the other way and takes that too far, and then their kids or grandkids say that's too far and take it back down the other way. So literally what you're looking at is a pattern of taking a good thing too far. Mm-hmm. People today might say, oh, me is bad or we is bad. Neither are bad. They're both beautiful things. It's simply when you take anything too far, it's too much. I remember when I was 12, I went to, I had $3 and I went to the local grocery store and I bought myself a half gallon of lime sherbet, and I ate it in an hour. I guarantee you I will never eat lime sherbet again because I took a good thing too far. You're not meant to eat a half gallon of lime sherbet by yourself. But in a bowl, it's great. It's fine, right? So there's a value in a me and there's a value in a we. The value in a me is about freedom and expression and self-expression and being able to dream and believe in big things. Right? And the beauty in a we is it's about coming together and doing what's best for society as a whole. It's about thinking about the connections and relationships between people. Neither of those are wrong. They're both beautiful things. But what happens when you take the me too far? When you take me too far, you become a society that is plastic and phony and a society of posers in essence. Right? So we reject that plastic nature, and the youth of society swing back towards a we mentality where our currencies are authenticity and transparency and about being real. When you take we too far, we lose our sense of self-identity, our individuality, and we start to demonize other people in groups. We look at the book I'm Okay, You're Okay, which was published within 10 years of the start of the last me cycle in 1969. And that book said, I'm okay, you're okay, we're all good, right? And if you look at that swing in me into the height of me, where it's I'm screwed up, you're okay. By the height of the me cycle in 1983 was I'm screwed up, you're okay. So I want to follow everything that you say. So this is when Tony Robbins came out, and Stephen Covey. Shortly thereafter is when the Chicken Soup folks came out, where it's all about personal development, and I'm going to follow a guru. Right, the guruship mentality was bigger in the 80s and 90s than it was even back in the 1960s. Different mindset, but much bigger. Then you move into the into the 1990s and early 2000s, and you move into a mindset of I'm screwed up, you're screwed up, right? So I'm screwed up, you're screwed up. So let's just get over our inadequacies and just start working together to do what's the best thing. This is what happens when you move into a we. Well, when you get to the height, the zenith of a we get into a mentality of I'm okay, you're screwed up. Mm-hmm. We do this in groups. And so Roy and I were able to predict the last 4 presidential elections utilizing pendulum theory, simply looking at the candidates, not based on party, not based on policy, not based on capability, but looking at the messaging of the candidates. And we've been able to successfully predict before the primaries who would win the election every single time. Not just simply ultra movement.
The last election, I'll be surprised, was quite a surprise to me. Very interesting. Well, we talk about at the height, once you get 10 years into the we, so this we cycle started in 2003. By 2013, we were 10 years into the upswing of the we. So once we hit the zenith of a we, 2023, 10 years on either side, so in this case 2013 to 2033, is what we call the witch hunt cycle. And literally every witch hunt in the history of the world, every single one, happened within 10 years on either side of the zenith of a we. Every single one. So when we look at the last presidential election, what were we looking for? We were looking for which members of either party would do the best job of leading a witch hunt. It didn't matter about policy. It didn't matter about anything else. Who would be the best witch hunt leaders? And Trump, far and away, was the best on the Republican side. And there was a question. Roy and I disagreed on Hillary versus Bernie on the other side. But in order to have beaten Trump, you would have had to be the bigger witch hunt leader, and Hillary Clinton was not that, in my opinion. Right? I had a disagreement on that. Bernie Sanders would have been a better witch hunt leader for the Democrats to have selected. Because he did the same kind of witch hunts in language that, from a liberal viewpoint, that Trump did from his pseudo-conservative viewpoint. So it was a very predictable model going back even to the primaries on who would be elected. And it's kind of funny because I wrote the question down, how are we seeing this play out today? And we just addressed that. But we did see it, and I specifically recall in the book 1983 being the zenith of the last me cycle, downswinging to 1993, which when I graduated high school, 1993 musically, because you guys do break down the components that I share with people of culture, literature, and music being the mainstays of where a society basically is sitting in those time frames. Now, in 1993, from 1993 to 1998, the music was just all over the map. It had no identity.
And that's why I would disagree with you. So let's look at musical movements, right? One of the things that we talk about as you move into either cycle, me or we, is that 10 years before the new cycle, we look for alphas in literature and technology. And 5 years before the beginning of the next cycle, we look for alphas in music. So if we go back to the previous we cycle, moving into a me, so 1953, let's look at who's our literary mentors that would be predictive of the me cycle. We look at books like Catcher in the Rye. What was the book Catcher in the Rye about? Well, Holden Caulfield was a character who rejected his family, his school, his government. He rejected everything. You see, we were at that point in 1953, 30 years into a we cycle. The idea of regimentation, conformity, and the loss of personal identity had permeated through society and had gone too far. You look back at the TV shows of the day, like Donna Reed and Leave It to Beaver, and all of those shows that painted an idyllic picture of Norman Rockwell, picture of America, which wasn't the reality, and the youth of America rejected that. And so you have that kind of a book. You also look at which rejected that conformity that existed, and it became one of the best-selling books of the next 30 years because of that mindset. It was an alpha predictive of what would happen in the me cycle. If you look at Jack Kerouac's book On the Road, right? Jack Kerouac, it was written in one sitting over several days, drug-fueled writing, but it was largely an autobiographical book about Jack Kerouac's adventures through middle century America, rejecting everything, literally rejecting everything, and searching for that sense of personal identity. So you look at that messaging and you contrast it to what was happening, you realize that the youth of society is now headed towards individuality and freedom. Another interesting publication that came out in 1953 was this men's magazine. It was about sophistication and exclusivity and about helping men be able to take ownership for who they were. And when Playboy was released, there was no pictures of nudity in the magazine at all. In fact, there was drawn nudity between 1953 and 1963. There were less than a dozen actual images of top frontal nudity in Playboy during that time frame, because it wasn't about pornography. It was a men's magazine, and it was literally about the individuality of the man. In fact, later in the 1950s, most people don't realize this, but CBS had Playboy TV, and Playboy TV was the first desegregated television show, period. Mm-hmm. Right? Playboy ultimately allowed some of the top writers of the last century to write for Playboy. And the genre of rock and roll was actually born and promoted in Playboy. The Beatles and Elvis Presley and a lot of the Rolling Stones, and a lot of other folks also wrote for Playboy. Mm-hmm. Right? That's where they started. There were John Updike and Shel Silverstein and others were writers who got nominated for Pulitzers while at Playboy. Right? It was not that. It was an amazing publication that was an alpha predictive of the me cycle. And actually, interestingly enough, as me went too far, so did Playboy. It was a really interesting contrast. But you then look at 1958. You're 5 years before the tipping point of 1963 into the me cycle, and we looked for an alpha in music. And as often happens in society, we don't look at ourselves. We look at other cultures to find our music. Now, Chuck Berry was the real inventor of rock and roll, but in 1953, our society was too racist to allow a black man to be the purveyor of our next type of music, so we had to find a white man to sing a black man's music. And, of course, we found that person from Tupelo, Mississippi in Elvis Presley. Right? And so Elvis Presley was the king of rock and roll. He popularized music from the African-American community into white culture. Now, I bring all of that up to bring us back to your question about the mid-'90s as it pertains to music and why I would disagree. Remember, we're dealing with movements from, in this case, me to we. In a me cycle, it's about the individual. It's about trying to be bigger and better than who you are. It's about trying to look at the big picture and the goals and all of those things, and not about dealing with the reality. Well, there was a movie that was released last year called Straight Outta Compton. And that movie was nominated for a couple of Academy Awards, and of course it was the story about NWA. And this NWA was founded, and this was like 86, 87, 88. This is 389. this included Eazy-E, Ice Cube, Running Man, and the infamous Dr. Dre. And they had this rap group that did what? They talked about what it was like growing up real in the ghetto. And NWA then begat a bunch of other what was called then gangster rap. And that gangster rap included Tupac and Biggie and Snoop Dogg and Nate Dogg and Warren G. And I mean, you can go on and on within that community that created that gangster rap ideology. And it permeated the youth of that part of our society because it was their reality. Well, at the same time, there was another musical system that a lot of the youth today don't recognize has an impact on music today that was coming to middle-class white suburbia, right? You might remember it was called the Grunge Movement. And it came out of Seattle, and it included bands like Nirvana and Pearl Jam and Hole and Stone Temple Pilots, and I mean, the list goes on and on and on. It was a huge, massive movement. And what did this music talk about? What it was like real, right? Think about the song Jeremy by Pearl Jam, where they prophetically talk about a kid in school who's bullied, who goes in and shoots up the class. This is before all of this is before Columbine, this is before all of the other school shootings. This is a prophetic song because it's real. It was talking about that angst that really did exist in society. And so when you talk about the music of the 90s, and you talk about, you had pop music, you had a bunch of things going on, but if you really look at the music that mattered, that moved culture and society, it was those two bits of music, gangster rap and grunge, that ultimately allowed us to find our modern, this recycles version of Elvis Presley. But even as of 1998, our society was still too racist to fully accept gangster rap, to fully accept the music like that from a black man. So we again had to find a white man to sing a black man's music. And in 1998, this was 20 years ago, 5 years before the tipping point, we found that white man to sing a black man's music in a gentleman by the name of Marshall Mathers, otherwise known as Eminem. And what did he do? He literally combined the angst of both the suburban white American households with the angst of the ghetto in poor minority communities and created a synthesis that appealed to everybody. And from 1998 until 2003, led by Eminem, rap became the single largest driving force in all of music. Right? But Eminem, I would posit to you, I'd suggest to you, would not have been possible without the movement of grunge and gangster rap in the late 80s and early 90s. Right? And so when we look at this movement and we look at going from me to we or we to me, the reason why we look at music and technology and art to understand where society is at is that when we look at politics, when we look at economics, we make decisions differently there than we do in our own personal lives as it pertains to how we live our lives and how we entertain and educate ourselves and other people. And so the movement, the cultural movements are best seen through the music that we listen to, the books that we read, the art that we consume, right? Those are the things that move us. And oh, by the way, in 1993, we did have a technology and a literary force that predicted this cycle, this we cycle that we're in today. It was a company called AOL, American Online, and they went public in 93, and they were both a technology that predated the internet, which really became the forerunner of the internet. Anybody who remembers AOL knows that we had chat groups and forums and all sorts of things that existed because of AOL. And they allowed for the proliferation of content. You know, you said at the beginning of the call that I'm in publishing, which is true. To me, what AOL did with the technology is they democratized, both they and then ultimately what became the internet, democratized publishing. They democratize our access into media and our ability to share our voice with each other, right? So that was the power of that technology that started with American Online back in 1993.
Now looking at how things are playing out today, are you bold enough to make any
about
what we're seeing? Just anything societal shifts as we approach 2023. I wanted to put what was going to be a Facebook Live video up as we're about to live through 1943 all over again. And one of the things that really stuck with me in the book is how around that time we had the rise of a lot of opposing forces that both had those tenets in mind, if that makes sense, politically on a global scale.
Well, it's interesting. The zenith of that was 1943, right? So the beginning of the witch hunt started 33 and ended 53. So at the end of that, in the U.S., we had, well, first of all, in the middle of it, during World War II, we did our own witch hunts, right? We had the Japanese intern camps, right? We literally jailed Americans because their heritage was Japanese. Even second generation, third generation Americans, we jailed them, right? That's not much better than what the Nazis did, right? Mm-hmm. We certainly didn't torture them, but we weren't much better.
Right.
We had McCarthyism and the Red Scare in the late 40s, early 50s, where we were scared of communists. We went out to root them out. We had the same. We did the same types of things that we saw in Europe, and right now we're seeing the same kinds of things play off. So a few predictions. I would suggest if Trump does not get impeached, that he has a very high likelihood of getting elected again. Not just because he's a sitting incumbent president, but because I don't believe that there's a Democrat currently out there that has a strong enough understanding of what's going on to be able to combat Trump. And let's be honest, I'm a marketer. Mm-hmm. I'm in awe of what Trump did. He was a masterful marketer. It's interesting. We criticize people like John Kerry or Dan Quayle or even Mitt Romney for both their intelligence but also their faux pas, their mistakes. When you become a public figure, there was in the me cycle a belief of the need for perfectionism in the way that you presented yourself. And so all of our politicians built the way that they presented themselves off of that old me ideology of perfection. Well, Trump came in understanding that being part of actually the TV movement into this with reality TV, right? His show was one of the very first. If you eliminate the Real World on MTV, was one of the first two reality shows on mainstream TV, and he understood what he was doing. He understood the marketing potential to his audience. And when he ran for president, both in the primaries and then in the general, he did what we would do in marketing. He oversimplified. He made things black and white. He got rid of nuance, and he started giving people nicknames. Because you know what? People in marketing, when we brand someone, that's what they remember. They don't remember all of the nuances and everything else. They remember the black and white pieces that are clear and obvious. And so what did he do? He did that. And he also unashamedly went out and said, you know what? In this cycle, people want what's real. I'm not going to pretend to be perfect and plastic like everybody else, and I'm going to leverage that against all of the other politicians. Because all of those other politicians have built their careers on coming off as sounding brilliant. Donald Trump's like, I'm not a politician. I'm not anybody else but this guy who's built a business, so I'm going to be like everyone else. Because the truth is, even on this call, you and I have made massive faux pas in language and discussion that would never fly on national TV, that would never fly in politics, that would never fly anywhere else, fly on a daily, and we do it on a daily basis in almost all of our conversations. But we judge our politicians with that higher standard, and Trump came in and said, screw that. I'm going to do it like everybody else, and I'm going to be unapologetic about it. Everybody's going to get it. So agree with his politics or not, the marketing that he came in with was an understanding of culturally where we were. He understood marketing and branding, and he did an infinitely better job than anyone else. And unless a Democrat comes in who understands those same things at the same level, who gives themselves that same kind of permission and culture, they're going to have a really hard time beating Trump, right? And everybody said, well, he couldn't win to begin with. They couldn't win the primaries. This is marketing, guys. At the end of the day, the average IQ is 100. The median's a deviation and a half below at 85. And the beginning of mentally handicapped starts at 79, right? You're dealing with a population, 50% of the population are within 6 points of the start of mentally handicapped. That's a reality. That's who we're marketing to. That's who we're promoting to. And policies don't actually matter. People elected Bush because they thought that they could sit down and have a beer with him, right? People loved Clinton because they thought he was they thought he was their best friend or their father or their grandfather, right? They loved Obama because he represented someone who grew up poor and the everyman. That's what we want. We want to be able to have those simple, identifiable things. Mitt Romney's not electable. John Kerry's not electable because they're not someone that we can identify with. They're rich white folks who we don't view as having had to struggle to get there, and they're too polished. That's not what we want. So. And frankly, that was Hillary Clinton. The only reason that Bernie Sanders worked better was because he wasn't a Democrat, right? He was basically he was independent, or a socialist, depending on when and how you talk to him, who came into the Democratic Party to take that over, and he was willing to say the harsher things that the other candidates weren't willing to do. And unless there's a Democrat who understands marketing, who understands messaging, who understands the cycle that we're in, it's going to be really hard as long as Trump isn't impeached or thrown out for something that he does, for Trump to lose. If we get into the election, Trump probably will win. That's a prediction that I would make.
Well, there you have it, man. A couple more questions. We'll call it. I mean, this is a good, powerful interview, and I love that I'm able to do this with you. As far as a marketer goes,
by the way, look, I want to point out I said nothing there that gives anyone any idea of what my actual politics are. So I can talk about it objectively without having to give my perspective.
I really don't like. I mean, I've kind of gotten my head. I used to work in talk radio and mired my head in that all the time, and I just stopped doing it. It's just. To me, it's pointless. I'm a big fan of control. Control the stuff you can control within the 3-foot sphere you walk around in. 12 steps of...
Let me really quick. Good. But with Trump, Trump said, that's not reality. Mm-hmm. That's not reality. So I'm going to just be me and say, hey, accept me for being a normal person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's kind of like getting a Facebook Live video going, and it can't get it. But hey, I was transparent. It is what it is, man. But for a marketing perspective, what's going to appeal, and actually, what's the right mindset for somebody to embrace moving forward as we hit this zenith of this we cycle?
So remember that the zenith is the witch hunt. Mm-hmm. So there's cultural implications to what I'm about to say, and I recognize that. But from a marketing standpoint, people identify more with what you stand against than what you stand for. Get rid of your unique value proposition and replace it with a clear statement of what you stand against. An example would be Netflix. Netflix put two major corporations out of business. Corporations that were on the New York Stock Exchange straight out of business. How did they do that? By stating what they stood against. What they stand against? Waiting to watch the movie that you wanted to watch. Right? When they came out in the late 90s, they said, we'll send you the DVD of any movie when it comes out. Just make sure you return it. Right?
They told them what they were not.
We stand against waiting. And they put Blockbuster and Hollywood Video out of business. And right now, they are putting massive pressure on HBO and Showtime and all of the major cable networks to be able to go in competition against them. They represent 40% of digital TV. Netflix does 40%, and they HBO and all the other movie channels, they're losing revenue to Netflix. because they're saying the same thing. Why wait to watch your movie or watch your series? Why wait to watch Game of Thrones? With House of Cards, let's let you binge and watch the entire series in one night.
The 12 steps of intimacy. You had brought that up, and that's a key component to the pendulum theory. A little bit on that.
It's a reflection of how to utilize Pendulum. It's not part of Pendulum, it's separate. But when Roy and I were doing the research for Pendulum, we asked the question, so in a me cycle, marketing and advertising is about direct response. Mm-hmm. We're going to promise everything for short-term results. It's the push-button easy, instant fame, instant money, instant success, instant diet. So you don't no work all in the moment. And that kind of hype worked, using sales strategies of get 80% off and all of those things. And it worked in a cycle where it was about pushing to be bigger and better than who you were. But as we moved into the we cycle, we saw that those old tactics didn't work anymore. And so we asked, based on the values in a we, what replaces the old form of direct response? And we said, in a me cycle, it's about push. In a we cycle, it's about pull. In a me cycle, it's about the individual. In a we cycle, it's about community. In a me cycle, it's about it's about transaction. In a we cycle, it's about intimacy. And so we said, what other industry? There's in business topology, we know that if you want to find a solution to an industry-wide problem, you don't look in the industry. You don't look at marketers and advertisers. You look outside of it at other industries. And so we asked the question, what industry better dealt with personal relationships better than marketing? And the answer that we came up with was marriage counseling. Mm-hmm. And so we then look at the origin of modern marriage counseling, and we went back to a gentleman by the name of Desmond Morris. Desmond Morris was a clinical researcher and a zoologist. And there was a clinical question in the late 1950s and early 1960s about the Homo sapien primate. Were we a pair bonded or promiscuous species? You see, in primates, the primates run the gamut of pair bonded and promiscuous, and how pair bonded or promiscuous that species of primate was based on the size of the male genitalia of that species. And the Homo sapien primate, the male of the Homo sapien primate happens to fit smack in between all species of primate. So there was a genuine question about whether or not we were a pair bonded or promiscuous species of primate. And so Desmond Morris did the work in the field, and what he determined was that the Homo sapien primate prefers the security of a pair-bonded relationship while still desiring promiscuity, but that the security of the pair-bonded relationship is what we naturally are drawn towards. So then he did the next set of research and said, what defines, for Homo sapien primates, a long-term relationship versus a short-term relationship? And what he found was that at the base level of all relationships, there are these 12 fundamental steps that must be followed. And that they call the 12 steps of intimacy. And if you skip more than one of these steps, any two or more steps, that the psychological impact on both parties is the same as having a one-night stand. Now, another analogy for your viewers to wrap their minds around would be the analogy of laying tile. And if you start off laying tile at the beginning of the room an inch off, by the end of the room, you'll be a foot or two off in terms of the spacing for those tiles. And psychologically, in building a long-term relationship with another human being, the same is true. If you skip two steps at the foundational level of that relationship, you may not see it immediately, but as you progress through the relationship, the damage that was done at the beginning that isn't seen starts to manifest itself as the two parties grow apart. And so the reason why this is a foundational part of marriage counseling today is that many marriage counselors, what they look for is what were the two steps that were skipped at the foundation of the relationship, because the solution or the solutions within those relationships are in fixing that relationship are partially based on figuring out how to fix the laying of the tile wrong, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so Roy and I then asked the question, what's the difference between building an interpersonal relationship with another person versus building a business relationship with someone? And what we fundamentally said is that psychologically there is no difference. A human being is a human being is a human being is a human being. Now, there are some tactical or tactile things that are different in building a relationship. In the 12 steps of intimacy, step 12 is sex. You're not going to have sex with your customers. It's just not something that you're going to do. But the principle is the same, right? What most people don't realize if they have someone they've had a relationship for a while is that it takes 8 steps in building that relationship before you kiss the other person. Now, those 8 steps may happen in 5 hours or in an hour or in 3 months, but they always happen, or almost always happen. In fact, we know, and this goes back to direct response, we know that if you, that in direct response that a great conversion rate is 3%. We also know that if you skip more than one of the 12 steps, that your potential of having a long-term relationship with that other person is less than 3%. Mm-hmm. That's just the reality of following these steps. And so what we look at is mapping out for our customers, what are the 12 steps of intimacy in building a relationship with your customer? We don't, to use the dating analogy, a traditional direct response marketer is kind of like a pickup artist. And a pickup artist, the job, what a pickup artist does is they apply a standard and a system, and they go out and hit on as many women as they can, and they know that if they get numbers, they know if they apply their system with 100 women, that they'll get at least 3 of them to sleep with them, right? So they know they're just running through their system within the numbers to be able to get to the transaction of getting laid. The same thing is true with direct response marketers. They have a system that they're running through with the intention of being able to have that transaction at the end. But culturally, that doesn't work. It doesn't feel good to the customers. A woman knows, a woman at a restaurant, bar, club, or event knows when a man's trying to get into her pants. So does a customer know when we as business owners are trying to get into their pants to grab their wallet, right? It's the same feeling, same psychology is the same. And so what we look at is understanding what are the currencies of intimacy. In building an interpersonal relationship, the currencies are time, energy, information, and emotion. And in business, our currencies are almost the same: time, energy, information, and money. But money is the last currency that we ask for. And often, business, while it's the lifeblood of a business, it's not the most important currency between two customers. When I have a client, his name is Garrett Gunnarsson of Wealth Factory, and when they work with a customer, they don't ask for the currency of money until step 10, because they're asking for intimate information, financial information, that doesn't allow them to be able to ask for money too early in the process without it violating the building of that intimacy with the customer. So the idea in building a relationship is to know what currencies are appropriate to ask at what point in the building of the relationship. And knowing that in a relationship, relationships are always 2 ways, right? If you've ever been in a relationship where you gave more than the other person, then you know that it doesn't feel good and it doesn't work out. Conversely, if the other party is giving more than you are, it's also not going to work out because there's not a mutual respect. The same goes into building relationships with your customers as well. There has to be a symbiotic relationship of give and take between both parties, where both parties are depositing into that relationship bank account so that when they pull out, it's a mutual and fair exchange.
It's the what's in it for me. And also the aspect of personal brands, and I see this happening all the time, especially with what you're talking about, the building of community versus some personal brands that I follow. There are 2 that come to mind. I'm not going to name them here, but I mean, you and I have talked about them. One of whom has really built an audience in the past several years just by doubling down on that community. He doesn't ask for much. He puts out value constantly. The other side, there's a ton of ask. There's a lot of, hey, I've got this to sell you now. Now I'm going to sell you this. Now I'm going to sell you, and the community really isn't there. So it's really kind of dead on how glaringly lopsided their audiences are. I think there's a virtue even in a we cycle that you can be a little bit of a me, but it's probably not going to be as robust or as popular, I guess, as what's happening on the other side.
Well, here's what I would say. There's a difference between being a leader and being individualistic. Also, there are always countercultures as well, right? So there are groups of people who will do the opposite of what the masses are doing. So part of the question is defining who your customer is, right? Are you going after the masses, or going after the mainstream, or are you going after a very specific targeted group that is idealistic, that is me-based? Mm-hmm. And in that case, that's fine, because you're meeting the customer where they're at. But beyond those small niche groups, and they do exist, what you could be an individual leader that can be strong as an individual. Look, we all make individual decisions. We're still individuals within the collective we, right? We're not Borgs. We are part of the we're still individuals. The difference is understanding what the value of society is, the value of culture, what value you're bringing to the table to deliver to someone else. And again, the reason why I like the 12 Steps of Intimacy and the tying business back into interpersonal relationship is, if you are looking at your significant other in terms of what you're going to get from them or what they're going to give to you, that's a bad relationship to be in. That's not a good relationship, right? A good relationship is when both parties are giving 100% to each other. That is equally true in business. And so it's more of a question of, are you willing to do what's necessary and commit to the other party? Are you willing to do all of the right things for your customer? And now here's the thing. Transaction-based marketing gets short-term results. Mm-hmm. And you get into the burn and churn mentality, right? Building relationships take time, especially when you're building them in non-intimate environments, right? Our call right now this recording is intimate between you and I. Mm-hmm. Everyone else that's watching, it's going to be in a non-intimate environment. Now, the fact that you and I are talking helps to bridge non-intimate and intimate, but it's still in a non-intimate format, mm-hmm. right? And so if I'm building a relationship with your audience, or even the way that you're building your relationship with your audience, it takes a lot longer, a lot more work, a lot more intentionality in what you're giving back in order for you to build that trust with your customer or your audience, because it's not done person to person. It's not done in an intimate environment. So it takes a lot longer to emulate that in that non-intimate environment. And so I bring that up from the standpoint to say that a good leader in a we cycle will be strong with who they are and what they know, but they're going to recognize that it's incumbent upon them to be able to invest into the relationship with the other person, with their audience base. And that's what one of the two gentlemen that you mentioned does so very well, is the investment back into the audience without the expectation of something in return. And that's the difference between a direct response and a relationship marketer. That's the difference between building a relationship with a significant other versus being a pickup artist. The pickup artist has an expectation. They have the expectation that they do these things and they're going to get a transactional outcome. In a relationship, if I go in to, if I had a significant other, if I went in with an expectation, it's not going to make that significant other feel good at all. Right? And that's not to say that there can't be fun transactional things, but if you are consistently going in and just expecting something from someone else, you're going to lose, because nobody likes to feel that way.
Yeah. So you're a fan of the relational aspect of things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Again, there's a difference between selling and conversion.
Yeah.
Right? Selling is convincing someone to take an action that they hadn't previously determined they wanted to take. Conversion is giving someone the comfort to take the action they'd already previously determined they wanted to take. Right? I would rather convert you than sell you. If I sell you and it doesn't go exactly as you think it should go, then I'm going to lose you as a customer. What's the saying? A person convinced against their will are of the same opinion still. Like, yeah, I can sell you once. That's burn and churn. I would rather spend the effort. It takes longer to get into revenue, but I'd rather spend the time and effort to build long-term relationships with my audience or customer, and have them trust me so that they keep coming back, than worry about that short-term revenue.
I understand. Well, Michael, I thank you for doing this with me today. I apologize for the technical difficulties we've had earlier. You do this presentation for companies that will have you. You're still doing this presentation, correct?
Absolutely, and we usually adapt it based on the country we're in, or the industry, because you can see these movements different in every country and in every industry as well.
And where can people go to find out more about that, to start that conversation and that relationship?
Well, you know what? I like to keep it simple. So obviously beyond being on Facebook, my personal email is michael@smartervoice.com. That's Michael at SMARTERVOICE.com, michael@smartervoice.com. And if anybody would like a copy of, well, I'm also on YouTube. There's a TED version from a few years ago that people can watch. And if anybody would like a white paper on the 12 Steps of Intimacy, I'm more than happy to send that to them as well. Just email me and I'll send it to them.
I've gone over that, and that's a very informative piece of literature that every business owner, every person in general, is probably behoove them to actually go over that. But again, thank you so much for joining me today. I apologize earlier for the for taking up too much of your time in terms of getting this thing going. But if anybody wants to reach out to Michael, you certainly have it. Is penduluminaction.com still up and going? I believe
it is.
Okay.
We've not quite updated it, but if anybody wants more on Pendulum, I'm more than happy to share that. And Jim, if you'd like to have me back, I'm more than happy to come back and talk about 12 steps or publishing or anything else that you'd like.
And maybe by then, Facebook will have its crap together. Come on, Zuckerberg. We got to go side by things going.
Billions of dollars. You can't make these that easy. Come on now.
You're letting us down. But yeah, absolutely. I'm even breaking down the 12 steps. I'm a huge fan from years ago, and I've been to the Wizard Academy and I've met you on occasion. Always amazing stuff. And definitely reach out to Michael if you have anything that you want to do for your business. And thank you once again, and I hope you have a great rest of your week. I'll be posting this soon. And the book, of course, will be it's on Amazon. You can download it and all that stuff. So,
and actually, there's a really amazing on Audible and Amazon, I believe, as well. An amazing audio book. Roy and I went into the studio and we brought in voiceovers and everything else. So it's much more like an old radio show where it's very entertaining. So I'd highly recommend that as well.
That's the Be Like Amazon book, right?
No, Pendulum.
Pendulum.
Be Like Amazon. Brian Jeffrey's book, Brian Jeffrey Eisenberg, and that's an amazing book as well.
Right.
That Roy wrote with them. But I'm saying in terms of Pendulum, the audio version of it is pretty stupendous as well.
For anybody listening to this book should be required reading. I think it's going to be a classic, right on up there of Think and Grow Rich, all the classics that people want to use for personal development. I think it's one of the best books you can read to really get the right frame of mind of what you need to do to appeal to people in the right way. So thank you again, sir. We'll talk soon.